Welcome back, beautiful souls, to Mind Clarity. I'm so grateful you're here with me today, ready to explore something that has the power to shift the way you see yourself forever. And if these ideas move you the way I hope they will, consider joining our membership, where we go even deeper into this journey together, week after week, growing and expanding side by side. What if everything you've ever believed about yourself is backwards? You think you're a human being who occasionally brushes up against something spiritual, but flip that thought completely. You are, in truth, an infinite spiritual being, only passing through this brief, temporary experience we call human life. And once you truly grasp that, manifesting stops being about chasing what you want. It becomes about awakening to what you already are. Manifesting isn't really about chasing after the things you want. It's much deeper than that. It's a kind of awareness, an understanding of who you actually are and where your attention flows. We tend to assume we're human beings who occasionally brush up against something spiritual, but it's actually the reverse. We are infinite spiritual beings passing through a brief stretch of time in human form. One thing I've noticed about people who reach real self-actualization is how they relate to death. They almost move past it entirely, as though it barely registers as an ending. That's because somewhere inside them, they carry a quiet certainty. Nothing truly dies. Things change shape, they transform, they take on new appearances, but nothing is ever destroyed. I think back often to my teacher in India, Swami Muktananda. Someone once asked him directly, "Master, what is real?" And his answer stuck with me. What is real is whatever never changes. Everything else is illusion. Lately, I've found myself returning to that idea and to another person who shaped my thinking, Dr. Maslow, who died on June 7, 1970. That date matters to me personally because it was the exact same day I stood on a stage in Detroit at Cobo Hall, receiving my PhD. Practically the same hour, in fact. It felt, looking back, almost like a passing of the torch, as if he were saying, "I brought this idea of self-actualization to the halls of academia. Now it's your job to bring it to everyone else. The cab drivers, the school teachers, the nurses, the students, all of it." At the heart of that idea is this. There's a higher place available to each of us, reachable right here in this very life. Muktananda pointed to the same truth from a different angle. What's real never changes, yet all of us walk around inside bodies we've mistaken for our true selves. We're completely convinced by it. I once lived inside a 21-year-old body, and now I couldn't locate a single trace of it anywhere on Earth. But while I was in it, I had no doubt whatsoever that this was simply who I was. Then I moved into another body, and another, and another. That pattern holds true for every one of us. Underneath all those changing forms, there's something in us that doesn't change. Call it soul, call it spirit, the label hardly matters. Years back, I spent an entire year immersed in the Tao Te Ching, and out of that came a book I wrote called Change Your Thoughts, Change Your Life. I worked through it one verse at a time, all 81 of them, starting January 1st of that year. I'd sit with each verse for about 4.5 days, reading it, turning it over, meditating on it, trying to really absorb what it meant. Then, in whatever time remained, I'd sit with a painting of Lao Tzu, a portrait someone had imagined and channeled based on a figure who lived 2,500 years ago. Someone had sent it to me through my radio show, and I never wrote a word without that image in front of me. I'd just gaze at it, let it speak to me, and then write. Some call the Tao Te Ching the wisest book ever put to paper. I once received a copy of a book that placed Lao Tzu's teachings on one side of the page and Jesus's on the other, and the overlap was striking. Sayings that echoed each other almost word for word, despite Lao Tzu having lived 5 centuries before Jesus was even born. I'm not suggesting anyone copied anyone. What I'm saying is that certain truths are eternal. They surface again and again across time, and for me, those truths trace straight back to the Tao. The very first line of the Tao Te Ching says, "The Tao that can be named is not the true Tao." The instant you try to pin down and define that invisible presence living inside each of us, the part that keeps inhabiting new bodies while the body itself keeps shifting and aging, you've already missed it. Who we really are is infinite. I put some thoughts down once about what I understand the soul to be, and I'd like to share them here. This part of you that never changes, that is genuinely infinite. The word infinite deserves real attention because it's the direct opposite of finite. Finite means something with a beginning and an end. If a thing had no starting point and no stopping point, we wouldn't even use the word finite to describe it. We'd say it simply continues, without interruption. The moment something takes on form, the moment it becomes tied to this physical, bodily world we all share, it shifts from the infinite into the finite realm. So trying to grasp the infinite using a mind that is itself finite is quite simply impossible. Lao Tzu understood this completely. It's exactly why meditation plays such a central role in the journey toward our highest self, toward truly knowing who we are. Meditation takes us to the place with no beginnings and no endings. Herman Melville once wrote that God's only voice is silence. That silence is the one space untouched by anything finite. And Blaise Pascal, the French philosopher and scientist, once observed that all of humanity's troubles stem from our inability to sit quietly, alone, in a room. Most of us aren't comfortable with that idea, though, because we've built our whole sense of self around what we can touch, see, feel, and smell, around what our five senses report back to us. But our senses deceive us. William Blake captured this beautifully in a poem he wrote back in 1777. He wrote of seeing a world within a grain of sand, and heaven itself inside a wild flower, of holding eternity in the palm of a hand, infinity within a single hour. He warned that we're all fed a kind of lie whenever we look with the eye instead of through it, an eye that comes into being one night only to fade away the next, while the soul rests untouched, wrapped in beams of light. We are, all of us, infinite beings moving through a brief human experience. I've said this so many times that it's become my go-to answer whenever someone asks for my favorite quote, my favorite piece of insight. It comes from Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, the French priest the Catholic Church excommunicated over his unconventional ideas. He said we are not human beings occasionally having a spiritual experience, it's the reverse. We are infinite spiritual beings moving through a temporary human experience, and the work is learning to live from that infinite place, coming to actually know our own soul. That's part of why I said yes when I was invited here. I practice yoga myself 5 or 6 times a week. I know firsthand what it does for my body, my health, my life, my emotional state. When I meditate, I feel it. When I do yoga, I feel restored. So I came. Getting to know the soul, the spirit, and letting go of the habit of defining ourselves through our physical senses is really the core of my newest work, a PBS special called Wishes Fulfilled. The whole message boils down to this: finding a concrete way to actually make contact with that infinite part of ourselves. And remember, if something is truly infinite, it has no starting point and no stopping point. That's simply what the word means. So if it never starts and never stops, what must it be doing? It has to be expanding. The moment it stops expanding, it's no longer infinite. It's become finite. At that point, we're not talking about the soul anymore. We're back to seeing with the eye instead of through it, exactly as Blake described. Here's something I wrote down along those lines. Call it the ideal of the soul. What the soul asks for isn't knowledge, isn't light, isn't even happiness. What it asks for is space, immensity. More than anything, it needs freedom to expand, to stretch outward, to embrace the infinite. That's the soul's true nature, infinity itself. And it grows miserable the instant it's boxed in or held back in any way. I have 8 children, 6 daughters and 2 sons. I used to joke that before I had kids, I had 8 theories on how to raise them. Now I have 8 kids and no theories left. But one thing I've learned about children, and honestly this applies to every one of us, not just kids, is that nobody likes being told what to do. There's a song I loved back in high school, something about giving Milan lots of land and the starry skies above. Don't fence me in, don't box me in, don't tell me what to do or how to dress or what to think, don't even tell me how to practice yoga. That's the soul talking. It is always pushing to expand, to grow, and whatever or whoever shows up in your life trying to restrict that will meet resistance. You'll feel yourself pushing back instinctively. You'll notice this especially in your yoga practice. Yoga, after all, literally means union. Union with your highest self, with God, with whatever you want to call that deepest place within you. So yoga, this idea of union, is really a path toward becoming what I'd call a living manifesto, someone capable of drawing into their life whatever they place their attention on. There was a period not long ago when a concept called the secret was everywhere. Magazines, newspapers, TV. I was invited to be part of that conversation and chose to step back from it for a few reasons. Mainly because, to me, manifesting isn't about attracting the things you want. Manifesting is an awareness, an understanding that you attract what you already are. I've spent a lot of time studying something called the I Am discourses, and I want to share a small piece of it. One of my favorite lines comes from the book Unveiled Mysteries. The right posture for someone wanting to work in conscious partnership with the divine isn't, "I wish I could go to them for guidance," praying to some distant source outside ourselves. As T.S. Eliot put it, we won't stop exploring, and at the end of all our searching, we'll arrive back at the place we started and recognize it, truly, for the first time. Eliot was writing about death, about leaving the body behind. I don't take it that way. I believe we can come to know that origin point and actually live from it while we're here. And then there are the words Jesus spoke in the book of John, that even the least among us can do everything he did, and even greater things still. There's something worth sitting with a little longer in this idea that manifesting has nothing to do with wanting and everything to do with being. Most people approach it backward. They treat it like a wish list, write down the car, the relationship, the number in the bank account, and then hold that image until it somehow shows up. But that's not really manifesting in the deeper sense. That's just desire dressed up in spiritual language. Real manifesting starts from a completely different place. It starts with the recognition that whatever you consistently are, your inner state, your beliefs about yourself, the frequency you live at day to day, is what keeps showing up around you. Not because the universe is granting requests, but because you can't attract what you aren't already resonating with. This is why so many people chase abundance while secretly believing, somewhere underneath it all, that they don't deserve it, or that it's scarce, or that someone else always gets there first. The wanting and the belief cancel each other out. You end up spinning in place. The shift happens not when you want harder, but when you stop identifying with lack altogether. When the felt sense of who you are moves from, "I am missing something," to "I already carry what I need." That's a completely different starting point, and it produces a completely different life. It also explains why people who've done real inner work often seem almost unbothered by things that would rattle everyone else. It's not that they've become numb or detached from life. It's that they've stopped mistaking the changing parts of themselves, the body, the roles, the possessions, the opinions of other people, for the actual self. When you know, even faintly, that some part of you was never born and will never die, the smaller disturbances stop having the same grip. Loss still hurts. Change still asks something of you. But underneath it, there's a floor that doesn't give way. The tricky part, and this is where most people get stuck, is that the mind wants to grasp this idea the same way it grasps everything else. Analyze it, define it, turn it into a concept you can hold on to. But the infinite by its very nature resists that. The moment you define it, you've made it finite. This is why the mystics kept pointing towards silence instead of explanation. Not because language is useless, but because language, definition, and thought are all tools built for the finite world. They're excellent for ordering groceries or building a bridge. They're the wrong tool entirely for touching something that has no edges. That's really the whole case for meditation and practices like yoga. They're not self-improvement techniques in the way people usually think of them. They're not about becoming calmer or more flexible, although those things happen along the way. They're methods for getting the noisy, defining, categorizing mind to step aside long enough that something quieter and older can be felt. You can't think your way into the infinite. You can only clear enough space for it to be noticed, because it was never actually absent. It was just crowded out. And there's a reason this keeps circling back to the idea of restriction, of not being fenced in. A soul that knows itself as infinite naturally resists anything that tries to make it small. External rules, but also the internal rules people impose on themselves. The self-talk that says, you're only allowed to be a certain way, only allowed to want certain things, only allowed to take up so much space. Growth, in this view, isn't really about adding new achievements or acquiring new roles. It's about continually loosening the grip of whatever's currently defining you as smaller than you are. None of this means abandoning responsibility or drifting through life untethered. It means holding your responsibilities, your relationships, your work, all of it, from a different center, one that isn't threatened by change because it was never dependent on any particular form staying fixed. That's the practical heart of it. Not escaping the human experience, but living inside it while remembering, more and more often, what's actually doing the living. One thread worth pulling on further is what actually happens in the gap between stimulus and response. Because that's where most of this philosophy either becomes real or stays theoretical. Someone cuts you off in traffic, a relationship ends, a plan collapses. In that instant, the old pattern is to react from the finite self, the one that feels threatened, that needs to defend its territory, that experiences the event as happening to it. But there's a slower, quieter alternative available in that same instant. It's the pause where you remember you are not only the reactive character in the story, but also the awareness watching the story unfold. That witnessing part doesn't get knocked off balance the way the reactive part does. It's not colder or more detached. It's actually more spacious, closer to what was being described earlier as the soul that needs room to expand. This is also where a lot of confusion creeps in, because people sometimes hear "you attract what you are" and turn it into a strange kind of self-blame, as if every difficulty in life is evidence of some inner flaw. That's not really what's being pointed to. It's less about moral judgment and more about resonance. A tuning fork doesn't do anything wrong by vibrating at its own frequency. It simply sets other things near it vibrating at that same frequency. The invitation isn't to feel guilty about hardship, but to notice which frequency you're carrying and to gently, patiently shift it when you can, understanding that shifting is a practice, not a switch you flip once. There's also something worth saying about how this connects to relationships with other people, especially the ones closest to us. If the soul's core need is room to expand, then love in its healthiest form isn't possession or control, it's the willingness to give someone else that same room. This is why so much unnecessary suffering gets created in families and partnerships by people who love each other but keep trying to shape one another into fixed, manageable versions of themselves. The instinct usually comes from fear rather than malice. Fear that if the other person changes or wants something different, the relationship itself might not survive. But a relationship built on keeping each other small tends to erode from the inside, while one built on mutual expansion tends to deepen, even through real difficulty. Then there's the matter of time, which deserves a mention because it quietly shapes how people relate to all of this. The finite mind experiences life as a straight line: birth, accumulation, decline, ending, and measures itself by how much has been gathered along that line. The infinite perspective doesn't erase that line, but it stops treating it as the whole picture. Practices like meditation offer brief, direct experiences of a kind of timelessness. Not because the clock stops, but because the part of you that's usually narrating, I am 42 years old, I have this much time left, I've accomplished this much, goes quiet for a moment. What remains in that quiet doesn't measure itself in years at all. People who return to that space regularly often describe feeling less rushed, less panicked about falling behind. Not because their circumstances changed, but because they stopped locating their identities so tightly inside the timeline. Finally, there's a practical honesty worth including here. None of this asks anyone to pretend the physical world doesn't matter, or that bills, bodies, and daily obligations aren't real and demanding. The point isn't to float above ordinary life. It's closer to holding two things at once: full engagement with the finite details of a day and a quiet, background awareness that you are not ultimately defined by any of them. That dual awareness is less a destination you arrive at once and more a muscle you keep exercising, a little more each time you remember to. So here's what it all comes down to. You are not this body, not these senses, not the finite shell you've mistaken for your identity. You are an infinite soul, always reaching to expand, always longing to return to the place you came from and finally recognize it for what it is. Stop letting the world fence you in. Stop defining yourself by what you can touch and see, and start living from that boundless place within you. Manifesting was never about attracting what you want. It's about awakening to what you already are. And once you know that, truly know it, even the greatest things become possible for you.